Story number 1.
I used to work night shifts at a 24-hour diner off the highway. It wasn't a bad job, just slow. We got truckers, late-night travelers, and the occasional drunk college kids, but most nights were quiet. There was one night, though, the night I still can't explain. It was around 2 a.m., and I was the only waiter on shift. There was just one customer, an old man sitting in the corner booth. He hadn't ordered anything, just sat there staring at the table, his hands folded neatly in front of him. I went over and asked if he wanted coffee. He looked up at me, and I swear for a second, I felt like I couldn't breathe. His eyes were wrong. Dark, sunken, like he hadn't slept in years. His skin was grayish, and his lips barely moved when he spoke. "She's coming." I blinked. "Excuse me?" His mouth twitched, almost like a smile, but not quite. "She's coming," he said again, his voice a dry whisper. I didn't know what to say. Do you want some coffee or?" He shook his head. I left him alone after that. He wasn't hurting anyone, and honestly, he creeped me out. I figured he was just some drifter passing through. About 20 minutes later, another car pulled into the lot. A woman got out, mid-30s, dark hair, wearing a long coat. She walked inside, her heels clicking against the tile. She didn't sit. She just looked around, scanning the diner. Then she turned to me. "Was there an old man here?" Something about her tone made my stomach twist. "Yeah," I said, nodding toward the corner. "Right over there." She glanced at the booth, then back at me. Her face stayed blank. "There's no one there." I turned. The booth was empty. The air felt thick. My chest got tight. I knew. He had been sitting there just moments ago. He hadn't left. I would have seen or heard him. The woman sighed like she had been through this before. She reached into her coat, pulled out an old, crumpled photograph, and held it out to me. Was this him? My hands shook as I took it. It was black and white, faded, but I recognized the face immediately. The same sunken eyes, the same not quite smile. I nodded slowly. "Yeah, that's him." She exhaled, long and tired. Then she put the photo away. "He died 30 years ago, right outside this diner, hit by a truck while trying to cross the highway." I felt cold all over. My skin prickled. Why was he here?" I asked. She just shook her head. "He always comes back, and every time he says the same thing." I swallowed hard. "What?" Her expression didn't change. "She's coming." She turned and walked out, leaving me standing there, my heart pounding. I never saw her again. Never saw the old man again either. But sometimes late at night, when I was alone on shift, I could still feel him. Watching. Waiting. Story the end.
Story number 2.
When I was in college, I took a job as an overnight security guard at a construction site on the outskirts of town. It wasn't a hard job, just a lot of walking around, checking the perimeter, making sure no one was trespassing. Most nights, I was alone, sitting in a small trailer with nothing but a cheap radio and a thermos of coffee to keep me company. The site was an old lot where a factory used to stand. They had demolished the building months before, and now it was just dirt, scattered equipment, and the skeletal frame of a new structure slowly taking shape. The first few weeks were quiet. Then I started seeing the footprints. Every night, I did a routine walk around the site. The dirt was always covered in tire tracks and boot prints from the workers during the day. But one night, I noticed something strange. Barefoot prints. Small ones, like a child's. At first, I thought maybe someone had wandered onto the site during the day, but I knew that wasn't possible. The workers wore boots, and the whole place was fenced off. No reason for a kid to be here, especially not barefoot. I followed the prints for a while, my flashlight sweeping over the dirt. They led toward the half-built structure, then just stopped. Like whoever had been walking vanished into thin air. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. That night, as I sat in the trailer, I kept glancing at the security monitors. The cameras weren't great. Grainy, black and white feeds with blind spots all over the site. But around 3 a.m., one of the motion sensors went off. Camera 4. It was aimed at the far side of the lot, near a deep trench where they were laying foundation pipes. I clicked on the feed. For a second, I didn't see anything, just piles of dirt and steel beams stacked in the shadows. Then something moved. A small figure. Walking along the edge of the trench. I leaned closer to the screen, my breath catching in my throat. It was a child. A little girl. She had long, tangled hair, and she was wearing what looked like a nightgown. She was barefoot. I grabbed my flashlight and rushed outside. The night air was cold, and the site was silent except for the distant hum of traffic on the highway. I ran toward the trench, my heart pounding. There was no one there. The dirt was undisturbed. No footprints. Nothing. I stood there, sweating despite the cold, telling myself I was imagining things. Maybe a glitch in the cameras, maybe my brain playing tricks on me after too many sleepless nights. But when I turned to go back to the trailer, I saw the footprints again, leading right up behind me. I quit that job the next morning. A few months later, I ran into one of the old foremen at a gas station. I asked him casually if anything strange had ever happened at the site. He hesitated, then said, "You ever hear about the old factory fire?" I shook my head. "Back in the 70s, he said. Factory caught fire in the middle of the night, killed a bunch of workers. But the worst part? One of the foremen used to bring his daughter with him on late shifts. Poor kid got trapped inside when the building collapsed." I felt my stomach drop. I didn't say anything. Just nodded, paid for my gas, and left. I don't know what I saw that night. I don't want to know. But sometimes when I pass by that lot, I swear I still see footprints in the dirt. Story the end.
Story number 3.
I used to deliver newspapers when I was a teenager. It was an easy job. Wake up early, bike around the neighborhood, toss papers onto porches. The pay wasn't great, but I liked the quiet of the mornings, the way the world felt half asleep. There was one house on my route that always made me uneasy. It was old, probably built in the early 1900s, set far back from the road, hidden behind a row of dead trees. The windows were always dark, the porch sagging, the grass overgrown. It looked abandoned, but someone paid for a newspaper every morning. I never saw anyone pick it up. Most of the time, I just tossed the paper at the edge of the driveway and kept moving. But one morning, after a storm had soaked the ground, my bike tire got stuck in the mud and I had to stop right in front of the house. That's when I noticed something. The newspapers were gone. Someone had been taking them inside. The house was still. No lights, no signs of life. Just that eerie, empty feeling it always had. I shook it off and kept going. A few weeks later, I had to collect payments from my customers. Most people left cash in an envelope taped to their doors, but the house at the end of the road was different. It had no mailbox, no visible doorbell. I almost skipped it, but then I saw an envelope wedged between the slats of the porch railing. It was old, yellowed, like it had been there for weeks. My name was written on the front in shaky, uneven letters. I opened it. Inside was the exact amount owed, plus a note. "Come inside. I have something for you." My stomach twisted. I looked up at the house, at the dark windows, at the front door that was slightly open. I left the envelope and biked away as fast as I could. The next morning, I skipped the house. I told myself it wasn't a big deal. People stop deliveries all the time. But that night, just as I was falling asleep, I heard something outside my window, a soft thump. Then another, like someone dropping something heavy onto the ground. I crept to the window and peeked outside. A rolled-up newspaper sat on the grass, the same one I had skipped that morning. Someone had returned it. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I told my boss I was quitting. I never delivered another paper again. A few months later, the house burned down. No one knew who owned it. The fire department didn't find any bodies inside, but when they went through the wreckage, they found something buried in the ashes, stacks of old newspapers, some dating back over 50 years. No one could explain it, and I don't want to know. Story the end.
Story number 4.
The forest near my childhood home was thick with trees, older than anything in the town. My friends and I had always heard stories about it, tales of people disappearing, of strange happenings deep in the woods, but they were just that, stories. Or so we thought. One summer evening when I was 16, I found myself with my best friend, Matt, and a couple of others walking deeper into the woods than we ever had before. The air had grown cool, and the sun was sinking behind the treetops, casting long shadows across the path. We were all joking around, not really thinking anything of it, until we heard it. A snap. The unmistakable sound of a twig breaking not far from us. "Did you hear that?" I asked, stopping in my tracks. The others looked at me, confused, but I could see that they'd heard it too. Matt, always the brave one, scoffed. "Relax, it's probably a deer or something." But it wasn't a deer. The noise was too deliberate, too loud. We continued walking, though now with an uneasy sense of awareness in the air. Then came another sound, louder this time. It wasn't just a snap, but a soft, drawn-out dragging sound, like something heavy scraping across the ground. My heart began to race. "Okay, that's not an animal," I said quietly, my voice trembling more than I cared to admit. Matt turned to me with a grin. "Don't be such a baby. It's probably someone messing with us." We pressed on, but the air felt heavier now, thicker. The trees seemed to close in around us, and the path we'd been following began to feel less familiar. I glanced at the others, but they seemed just as confused as I was. The woods looked different somehow, darker, more oppressive. Then we came to a clearing. The sight of it startled me. I'd never seen this part of the woods before. There was an old shack in the middle, partially hidden by overgrown ivy and twisted branches. It was barely standing, the roof sagging and the walls warped from age. The window panes were long gone, and the door hung loosely on its hinges, swaying in the breeze. "Is that new?" Matt asked, looking at the others. None of us had ever seen it before, and none of us had any idea how it could have been missed, considering we'd all grown up nearby. But there it was, standing in the middle of the woods, an eerie presence that seemed to pull us toward it. "Let's check it out," Matt suggested, his usual bravado pushing him forward. I hesitated, but before I could protest, he was already walking toward the shack. The others followed, though I could see the nervousness on their faces. As we approached, I noticed something odd. There were marks in the dirt around the shack. Faint impressions, as though something large and heavy had been dragged across the ground. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. "All right, I think this is a bad idea," I muttered under my breath. But it was too late. We were already standing in front of the shack. Matt pushed the door open, and it creaked loudly, sending a shiver through me. Inside, the air was damp, and a strange, metallic smell lingered. There was nothing inside but debris, old pieces of wood, rusted metal, and shattered glass. It was exactly what I'd expect from an abandoned shack, but something felt wrong. The temperature had dropped significantly, and the stillness was oppressive. "Let's take a look around," Matt said, stepping further into the room. His voice echoed oddly in the small space, making it sound like there was something else in there with us. I stayed by the door, my eyes scanning the dark corners of the shack. Then I saw it. A shape in the far corner, partially obscured by a pile of debris. At first, I thought it was just another pile of old junk, but as I focused, I realized it wasn't. It was a body, a human body, lying face down in the corner. I froze, my blood running cold. My first instinct was to shout, to run, but my voice wouldn't come. My legs wouldn't move. It felt like time had stopped, and all I could do was stare at the form, my mind racing with confusion and fear. "Matt," I whispered hoarsely, but he was already out of earshot, rummaging through some of the old wooden planks. I had to move. I had to get out of there. I took a step back, my eyes still locked on the body. That's when I noticed something else. There were marks on the walls, deep gouges, as if something had scratched its way through the wood. The air smelled wrong, like decay, and I could hear the faintest whispering, almost like voices, but muffled, distant. I backed up, stumbling toward the door, when I heard a sudden movement from behind me. I spun around, expecting to see Matt, but instead, the body in the corner had shifted. It wasn't just lying there anymore. It was slowly, agonizingly dragging itself across the floor. I screamed and ran, not even caring if the others heard me. I bolted out of the shack and into the clearing, my heart pounding in my chest. Behind me, I could hear footsteps, quick, heavy, and dragging, like something was coming after me. I didn't look back. I didn't dare. I ran until my lungs burned, pushing my legs to their limits. But the sound of dragging footsteps was always just behind me, like it was closing the distance, getting nearer and nearer with every step. Finally, I broke out of the trees into the safety of the road where the woods gave way to the fields. I collapsed to the ground, gasping for air, my hands trembling uncontrollably. I turned around, expecting to see something chasing me, but the woods were silent. The others caught up to me moments later, winded and confused. Matt was the first to speak. "Why the hell did you run like that?" he asked, laughing as if I'd just lost my mind. But when I looked at him, I saw the fear in his eyes. He had felt it too. We all had. We could all sense it, the wrongness of the woods, the feeling that something was watching, something that didn't want us there. We didn't speak much on the way home. When we finally reached town, we went our separate ways, each of us too shaken to talk about what we'd seen. It wasn't until years later, when I spoke to one of the older locals, that I learned the truth. The shack had once belonged to a hermit who lived in those woods, but one day he simply vanished. No one knew where he went or what happened to him. But there were rumors of a man who had gone mad, who had started living in isolation, cutting himself off from the world. Some said he had begun to worship something dark in the woods. Others whispered that he had made some sort of pact, a deal with whatever haunted those trees. And when I asked about the marks on the shack's walls, the old man told me one thing that chilled me to the bone. Sometimes the woods take people. They take them and they don't let go. I never went back to that place, and I never will. Story the end.
Story number 5.
The house was never quite right. When I was a kid, my family moved into an old farmhouse on the outskirts of a small town in Ohio. It was a 2-story place with peeling white paint and a front porch that sagged in the middle. My dad got it for cheap. He was always looking for fixer-uppers, but this one never seemed to get fixed. There was something off about it from the moment we stepped inside. The air was heavy, thick with the smell of damp wood and something else, something sour. The previous owners had left in a hurry, and the house felt abandoned in a way that was deeper than just being empty. The first night I heard something scratching in the walls. My parents said it was mice. But the sound was slow, deliberate. It started in one corner of my room and moved across the wall to the other side. Like something was feeling its way through the house. At night, the house creaked and groaned more than any house should. There were footsteps, too. I heard them in the hallway, soft but unmistakable. My parents told me it was just the house settling. But one night, I heard the footsteps stop outside my bedroom door. They just stood there, waiting. I couldn't breathe. I pulled the covers over my head and lay still, trying to convince myself it was my imagination. But then the doorknob rattled. Just once. I told my parents, but they brushed it off. My dad said I was just getting used to a new place. My mom gave me a nightlight, as if that would fix anything. But things got worse. During the day, I'd catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye, a shadow darting past a doorway, the feeling of being watched when I was alone. The worst was in the basement. It was unfinished, with stone walls and a dirt floor in one corner. Something about it felt wrong, like the air was thicker down there. I refused to go down alone, but my dad kept tools down there, so I was sometimes forced to. One afternoon, I was down there looking for a hammer when I felt something behind me. It wasn't a noise, just a shift in the air like someone was standing too close. I turned around so fast I nearly tripped, but nothing was there. Still, the feeling didn't go away. It pressed down on me, heavy and suffocating. That night, I had the worst dream of my life. I was lying in bed, unable to move, staring at my closet door. It creaked open slowly, and something stepped out. I couldn't see its face, only a shape, tall, thin, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. It took one slow step toward me, then another. I wanted to scream, but my throat was locked. It reached out a hand, long fingers stretching toward my face, and I woke up. I was soaked in sweat, my chest heaving. My closet door was open. I was sure, positive. I had shut it before bed. That was when I started sleeping with my door locked. One evening, I was home alone. My parents had gone into town, and I was watching TV in the living room when the power went out. The whole house went pitch black. Then I heard it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from upstairs. I froze, every hair on my body standing on end. The steps moved down the hallway toward the staircase. Then they started coming down, one step at a time. Creak, creak, creak. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. Then silence. Whoever or whatever it was had reached the bottom step. The living room was completely dark, the only light coming from the moon through the window. My heart was pounding so hard it hurt. I strained to listen, but there was nothing, just the sound of my own ragged breathing. Then, from the darkness, a whisper, so close, right behind me. I see you. I ran. I don't even remember grabbing my keys, but I must have, because I was in my car before I knew what was happening, my hands shaking so hard I could barely get the key in the ignition. I didn't go back inside until my parents got home. I tried to tell them what happened, but my dad just got mad, saying I was scaring myself. My mom looked worried but didn't say anything. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard it again. Footsteps, slow, steady, coming down the hall. They stopped outside my door. I held my breath. Then a quiet, deliberate tap tap on the wood. I didn't sleep that night. We lived in that house for another 6 months. I barely spoke. I barely ate. The thing in the house, whatever it was, didn't want us there. It didn't care if my parents believed or not. It was patient. It was waiting. One evening, my mom sat me down. She looked pale, nervous. She asked me if I had ever seen anything in the house. I hesitated, then nodded. She swallowed hard, then whispered, "I see it too." That was the last night we spent there. My dad fought it, but my mom wouldn't listen. She packed our things and took me to my aunt's house while my dad stayed behind to finalize the sale. A week later, he showed up at my aunt's door with dark circles under his eyes. He wouldn't talk about it. We never mentioned the house again. Years later, I looked it up. The house had been abandoned again. No one stayed long. I found an article from the 1950s. A man had lived there alone. He had been found at the bottom of the basement stairs, his neck twisted at an impossible angle. The paper said it was an accident. I don't think it was. Story the end.
Story number 6.
I grew up in a small town in Minnesota, the kind of place where everyone knows each other. Nothing ever really happened there. No major crimes, no big mysteries. It was just quiet, normal. When I was 17, my best friend Adam and I got into the habit of sneaking out at night. Not to party or do anything wild. We just liked the freedom. We'd ride our bikes through town, stop at the gas station for snacks, and sometimes explore the wooded trails outside the neighborhood. One night in late October, we decided to check out an old house on the edge of town. It had been abandoned for as long as I could remember. Everyone had stories about it. Kids at school dared each other to go inside, but no one ever did. They said the last family who lived there just up and left, leaving everything behind. Dishes still in the sink, clothes still in the closets. Adam had a flashlight, and I had a pocket knife, just in case. The front door was unlocked, but it took some effort to push it open. The air inside was thick with dust, and it smelled like mildew and something else, something rotten. The house was dead silent, except for the occasional creak of the floorboards beneath our feet. We walked through the living room first. There was an old couch covered in a white sheet, a coffee table with a yellowed newspaper from the 80s. A broken TV sat in the corner. It really did look like the family had left in a hurry. We moved to the kitchen next. Dishes in the sink, a rusted kettle on the stove. The fridge door was open, empty except for black mold creeping along the inside. I was starting to get that uneasy feeling, like we weren't alone. I glanced at Adam, and I could tell he felt it too. His grip on the flashlight had tightened. Then we heard it. A soft thump from upstairs. We froze. Adam turned the flashlight toward the staircase. Another thump, this time louder. It wasn't the sound of an old house settling. It was footsteps. Someone was up there. We should have left. We should have run out the front door and never looked back. But we were stupid kids. Adam whispered, "Let's just take a quick look." I didn't want to, but I wasn't about to let him go alone. We crept up the stairs, each step groaning under our weight. At the top was a long hallway with 4 doors, 2 on each side. The air was colder up there, and the rotten smell was stronger. Adam whispered, "Which room?" I shook my head. Then the door at the end of the hall creaked open. I barely breathed. Adam swung the flashlight toward it, but the light flickered, just for a second. And in that second, I swear I saw someone standing in the doorway. Not a shadow, not a trick of the light. Someone. Tall, thin, their head tilted too far to the side, as if their neck was broken. Then the flashlight came back, and the doorway was empty. Adam grabbed my arm. "Did you see that?" I nodded. We turned and bolted down the stairs. Halfway down, Adam tripped and crashed onto the floor. I spun around to help him up, but then I saw it. The door at the top of the stairs, slamming shut on its own. We ran. Out the door, onto our bikes, pedaling as fast as we could. I didn't stop until I was back home, locking every door behind me. We never talked about it after that night. Not once. A few years later, I was back home from college and heard that the town was finally demolishing the house. The stories had never stopped. People still heard noises, saw movement in the windows. No one ever lived there again. The night before it was torn down, I drove past it one last time. The windows were boarded up. the front porch sagging worse than ever. But just as I was about to pull away, I saw something in the upstairs window, a shadow, tall, thin, head tilted too far to the side, watching me. I drove away and never looked back. Story the end.